Sure. Before we get to today's, excuse me, something in my throat there. Before we get to today's slides, the topic is Japanese art. And I know some of you know from your mini bios something about one of the categories of Japanese art that we're going to discuss in some detail that's still very popular in various formats. We'll get to all those slides in a few minutes. Two things. First of all, I sent all of the, let me get these people in here. Okay, there we go. Welcome. We're just starting. I'm just giving a couple of quick announcements before we get to the first slide today of Japanese art after 1300. Okay, first of all, I sent all of the grades for the papers that were turned in on time by yesterday evening. So you should have those in your inbox. If you haven't checked in the last 24 hours, you should check again after class. They're pretty self-explanatory. I double checked the ones I didn't grade myself. I double checked, and in one or two cases, I would add a couple of points if the reader overlooks something. So if you are one of those who hasn't yet turned your paper in, you still have time. I mean, you know, there's no, well, yeah, there is a deadline. The deadline is the week before final exams, but don't let yourself get pushed into that kind of a corner, because I guarantee it won't lead to a good grade. But here's what I want to say about the papers I did grade. First of all, they were mostly A's and B's. Those are excellent grades, above average, and were well written. And even those that weren't of, you know, at that level grade wise, all the papers had something interesting, reasonably original to say. Just if some parts of the instructions were not followed, like for instance, only 6 of the 10 elements of composition were described or analyzed, then of course it wouldn't allow that paper to get an A or a B. But even then, on the meaning especially, I noticed that people did seem to really get seriously involved in finding out new information, even about something as well known and overexposed as Starry Night by Vince Van Gogh. A couple of the papers I read were on that subject, and you know, at first I think, oh gosh, there's nothing new in this that I'm going to learn, but it turned out that, at least for this class, that I did see that even papers about, you know, Michelangelo's David or The Last Supper had something original to say. So a good sign that this class, the goals of this class are resonating, which is to learn about how to look at art and want to know more about whatever works of art you find interesting. Okay, so let's just say kudos for that. If your paper wasn't done, try to get it in soon, because you certainly don't want to push it too close to the second midterm, because that'll take some time, and I'll explain. I mean, it's not until early November, but well before that, I'm going to give you information, send you email, and tell you in class what that test will look like. It won't be the same as the first midterm. It's a new format that is required by the art department committee that formed to revise the class requirements. Hi. Anyway, so I've sent, you know, responses to the emails I saw, although if I got an email in the last hour and a half or so, I wouldn't have responded. I was commuting and getting here, grabbing quick lunch and setting up. Okay, so let's say one more thing. Extra credit. If you got, you know, a B, that's a good grade, but you could easily end up with an A in the class, or even if you got a C on your research paper, either because it was late or you forgot to do some parts of it. That doesn't mean you couldn't still get an A in the class because of all the extra credit options. And so I urge people to take advantage of those. And so far, only a few people have done some. I mean, several students have done 10 or 15 or even 20 points, but no one's done the maximum of 50. No, 60, that's right. It's 60 points total that you can get if you do all the different options. It's, you know, and that's already, I've sent the, you know, it's in your first handout. I said, we went over in class. So if you need to refresh your memory, go back and watch the first lecture on YouTube, week 1, and you'll see I describe each detail. If you still have more questions, of course, about individual extra credit options, don't hesitate to, well, you could ask me. Let's save that for the end of this lecture, for those that might need or have a reason to want to ask that, or just an email that's even more direct, of course, and confidential. Okay, so I'm going to talk about Japan And I'll give you a little context. Now, I don't have a separate slide of a map. I'd love to have one. I've never been to Japan. I've always been interested because my parents played matchmaker to two couples in Chicago on the South Side where I grew up. And it was fascinating where there were mixed race couples, and in one it was the wife and the other was the husband, who were of Japanese descent. One was from Japan. He was a pilot for Japanese Airlines, and he was a superb cook, Japanese food. I mean, that's how I learned long before most people who look like me knew what sushi was or anything. We ate that in the 60s in Chicago because this guy was such a great cook and a friend of our family, and my parents had helped him meet his wife. And then the other were a family with 3 kids, almost the same ages as me and my brothers. They were artists, and their books are still in print. They have traditional Japanese style. They both passed away years ago. Husband was from Ireland, wife was Nisi. She had been in one of those camps during, World War II, when we totally illegally rounded up American-born native citizens because they were Japanese descent. Everybody knows about that by now, I hope. That unhappy chapter in the 40s, in the 240s. Anyway, so she and her husband were illustrators and writers of children's books on how to do Japanese art, and they're still in print. If you're interested in that, you could email me. I don't want to get too much detail now because we want to get started with the slide. So I know something about Japanese culture from the people I know over here who are of that heritage, but I've never been there. So let me just give you 3 facts about it, and then we'll get started for context. First of all, Japan is an island that's about the same size as California. Interesting. Yeah. That means that it has, because it has 3.5 times our population, well, more than 3 times, nearly 130 million, and California is just now dropped a bit at about 30, not quite 40 million. So if you do the math again, there are 3.5 times as crowded as we are, the island of Japan. So it's the size of California with a population of 3.5 times California's, about 130 million. And it's the 3rd largest economy in the world. Some of you may know that. That's an amazing fact. I mean, most of the other, the top 10 world economies in terms of total gross national product, right? You know how they count that. It's a pretty consistent measurement that's objective. The biggest economy is the US, then China, which is growing faster. We'll see, they may become the biggest, but they're second at the moment. And then Japan. It's pretty amazing. Plus, they have multiple centuries, many centuries, even thousands, not quite 5,000 years of urban civilization the way China does, but close. About 3,000 or so, or that you could trace back. But we're focusing on the last few hundred years. So let's get to our first slide. Okay, from the syllabus. And this one illustrates 2 things. But first, let's get it full screen. And yeah, okay, you guys can see this, right? I did want to restate one definition from Monday's lecture because it applies to both Chinese and Japanese architecture. And I think I got off on a rough start and had to state that definition more than once. So let me just give you that succinct definition, because the word pagoda, it's at the top of your list of terms to know for this week on, I think it'd be the 2nd page, right? From the beginning of the semester. No, actually it's the 3rd page. The top of that page, pagoda, right? You see it there. Here's that definition in case you weren't here on Monday or checked out early or weren't quite sure how to write it. Here's the right way to write that. Pagoda is a multi-level Buddhist house of worship, multi-level Buddhist house of worship, with wide overhanging eaves. I think most people know what that word means, E-A-V-E-S, with wide overhanging eaves supported by projecting wooden brackets, supported by projecting wooden brackets, which means the structure of the pagodas are always wood. The roofs are made out of tile or even metal sometimes, but the walls and the supports, the framing, including the roof beams, are wood. So it's an ancient form of, or a very old form of architecture that goes back thousands of years in Asia, particularly in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia, and of course, Japan. Okay, so here's our first must-know slide. This is a very interesting, and I'll go ahead and let you know, somewhat controversial work, but remember the time frame we're looking at. It's nearly 300 years ago, or 250 years. Flowers of, the title here is Flowers, plural, right? Flowers of Beauty in the Floating World. Okay, Japan, all those words, as you guys can spell, of course, and the location of all these slides is, well, no, actually, some of them we give you, rather than the location, we give you the artist name if we know it, but we don't know who this artist was. So it's just the Japan, the location. And then the last thing, the date, 1769. Okay, what are we looking at? We're looking at example of ukiyo. That's a really important definition. I'm not cutting this slide from the study list. So you want to take extra thorough notes. It has a good possibility of being on some part of the final exam. Okay, so what is ukiyo? That definition might appear also on the final as part of the true false. Well, it's the second word down on this week's list on page 3 of your list of terms. Okay, ukiyo is a category of Japanese art, which means images of the floating world, comma. That doesn't tell you anything, right? But that's the translation of that term. Again, it's a category of Japanese art, which means images of a floating world, comma, and which emphasizes the transitory nature of life, which emphasizes the transitory nature of life by illustrating the pleasures we should enjoy while we're alive, period. By illustrating the pleasures we should enjoy while we're alive, period. Okay, everybody got that? That is a complex concept, and yet in a way it's simple once you look at each work of art that fits that category. This is definitely an example of ukiyo art. And that's what I was saying earlier, when there's anime and all that, but the roots of some of the current Japanese influenced graphic arts I'm talking about, and people use quite a bit, if not more now than they did 10 or 20 years ago, in many kinds of visual formats, for websites and, animated film and all that. The roots are in this movement, ukiyo. It goes back at least about 300 years in Japanese art history. So why is this an example of ukiyo? It's the main part of the meaning. Well, these are two young women in a brothel in the port of Tokyo. Tokyo was at that time called Edo. You don't have to know that, but it's, if you happen to do research or look this up, or want to do extra credit, you want to know that Tokyo, you didn't used to be called that. It was called Edo. That was the Japanese name for what's now called Tokyo. It was the largest city in the world, according to several historians, just say many historians believe it was the largest city in the world. I would maybe hedge on that and say London and Tokyo were the two largest cities on earth in the 18th century. By the late 1700s, there's no question London had 1 million people by that time, at least. But so did Tokyo. There were no other cities in the world with that many people. So it was one of the two largest, if not the largest city in the world. It was the capital of the kingdom, and it was a kingdom of Japan. And it was the center of Japanese art, as you'll see while we go through these slides today. Okay, so all I said was that this is two women, the adult woman, obviously the older, larger woman sitting, looking down at the younger one. She's actually currently living in a brothel and therefore is a prostitute. The woman next to her, who knows, the little girl, it's a little girl, right, obviously, is probably her daughter. And my assumption, based on the research I've done about these images, would be that she is probably going to end up being trained to do the same work her mother did. But there's an important point to make here. It's nothing to do with, what we think of that, kind of activity or profession. That's not the point I want to make. That, obviously people have already formed your opinion. I'm just going to say that at the time this was made, this was not considered controversial. This was an example of one of the many pleasures that we can enjoy. You could say pleasures of the flesh, but that sounds kind of corrupt, doesn't it? They didn't see it that way. They saw it as a spiritual quest as well as a physical quest for finding satisfaction in this life. That would include food, theater, live theater. Obviously, this kind of activity for some people, not most people wouldn't do this, but certainly the upper middle class or upper class would have perhaps considered this as part of that philosophy of enjoying the pleasure of this life. And then there was also the poetry and the literature and the music that they're so famous for, Japanese composers and poets. If you know anything about Japanese literature and music, they were producing great works at this time. So it isn't only pleasures of the flesh, literally. It meant things that satisfy us in our quest for enjoying this life while we're alive. So that's what ukiyo means. But there's another aspect of the meaning here. It's a classic example of Japanese print making. This is a print with the illustration here, probably describing what's happening and maybe even naming the two women in this, the two people in this image. In any case, it would certainly have said where it was, which is the port of Tokyo. In other words, Tokyo, the edges of the city of Tokyo. But what's more important are there two more things about the meaning. That Japanese prints were hundreds of years old by the time this was created, and they're still being made with two main features that mark them as classic examples or traditional examples of Japanese prints. One is the oblique angle. I mean, look at the angle of the window seat they're sitting on. It's obviously a very sharp diagonal, and it's even exaggerated to the point where it isn't in perspective. It's not meant to be. They weren't concerned about accurate details. I mean, there is, of course, we'll get to the elements of space in a minute when we do the formal elements. But to finish up on the meaning, this has a traditional Japanese style of printmaking, this illustration, because of the oblique angle. I mean, the whole room is skewed towards the upper right, extreme diagonal towards the upper right. And then the other thing is the bold outlines around the main figures or objects, not just the humans, the two humans, but the window seat itself, the window framing, and even the flower pot here. Bold lines around the main objects are another all Japanese print. Okay, so let's talk about the formal elements. Well, let's do space. This one does have, but can't, here's another, is this shorter or narrower? The further away we get, it's the opposite. That's not how we would perceive this object unless it was a very unusual carpenter who created that window seat and made it wider the further away it goes from this lower corner of the lower left. And so that's distorted proportion there, by the way. So let's go ahead and say the proportions here are accurate, or you could say normal on the two human bodies, but they're distorted on the windowsill. And therefore that is an example. Now scale though is accurate. The smaller figure is a child next to an adult, so their scale to each other is accurate, and their scale to the room they're in is pretty accurate. But the proportion on the framing there, it's a window seat. What else do you call it? That's distorted. That's exaggerated. Okay, but the space techniques, then you can't say I don't see foreshortening because of that, but you do see obviously overlapping, diminishing size, right? Is there scientific perspective? No, they did not have or even concern themselves with that technique, at least not this far back in Japan. So there's no scientific perspective and there's no atmospheric perspective. And you might think there's a register line, but look carefully. That's just the bottom edge of the window. So really there's no register line. So it's just overlapping and diminishing size. Okay, then we have colors. Well, they're warm colors mostly on the clothing. But their skin is probably with makeup made unnaturally white for some effect that they would have been asked to have, perhaps when they were meeting people in any public setting. So the white colors, of course, are abnormally cool. Most human skin tones, remember, are warm, but here they're not. They're cool. And then we have the warm brown or tan colors on the whole, window framing and the window seat and the boats. And then it's kind of a light tan, I would call it that, on the water. So it's more warm than cool. Of course, the green sashes here are cool. I already mentioned the bold outlines. Okay. Is there modeling? Minimal. I would say very little, and only on the hair of the two females here. That's really it. I don't see modeling on their clothing. Well, on the bottom, sorry, there is a little bit, that's true, on the bottom panel or section of the window seat. So minimal modeling. The simulated texture, though, is excellent. It's good on there. Every detail on the wood framing of the room, their clothing, their hair, the potted plant, the boats, even the water. There's a lot of simulated texture here and very realistic. The largest mass, pretty easy. It's the adult woman. Then I guess the windowsill, and then the little girl, in that order. And let's see, balancing, yes, with her in the middle, the adult woman looking out, I think she is, right, out at the water. She's pretty much arranged across, part of her slightly to the left and the other bottom half of her body slightly to the right, so I would call it roughly balanced. And the floor to me and the scroll up here, the lettering, roughly equal. The area below them and above the water in the landscape is pretty much the same area. So it's roughly balanced left to right and top to bottom. Obviously, he's got full of rhythm with arms, hands, legs, feet. Okay, let's see. All right. I'm going to cut one of these. I usually do that when we, go through a new topic, if it's whether we have enough time, but also because I'd rather focus and spend more time explaining things that are more likely to be on the test. So this one, partly because I couldn't get a larger image than this out of Stocksted's files, which I got most of these slides from. So here we go. Take your pens if you have them, hopefully nearby. And we're down, you see on the next page at the top of this topic today, Japanese art, right after 1300. The one below, the first one we covered. The second slide, cross it off. Landscape by Bunsai. Well, it's not going to be on the final, okay? So everybody got that? Second slide down, top of the page under Japanese art, cross it off. But not this one. This one I'm not going to cut from the study list. It's Himeji Castle. That's Himeji, again, Himeji, Castle, two words, just like castle spelled in English. The location, we give you the city. It's one of the largest cities in Japan, Osaka. Osaka, that's Osaka. And the date is 1609. This is a very classic example of the pagoda style of architecture applied to a military or fortified site. So it's never been a house of worship, though people could have prayed inside the building. We'll say, well, that could have happened in a minute, but just start by saying this is, as the title gives us a clue, a fortified structure, a castle, a military installation. You could say it any way of those, but the word castle pretty much summarizes that. It was built for military purposes. It was the headquarters of a warlord. That's a very important fact. That's the main part of the history of Japan. In the 1600s, when this was built, Japan was in the era they call the era of the warlord. And those were, they have a name in Japan. Some of you may even remember there was a TV series a while back that was named after this phenomena. Shoguns were the Japanese word for warlords, S-H-O-G-U-N. Shoguns were ruling most of Japanese society. In other words, various warlords with their armies. Of course, they were paid, as you might guess, they were mercenaries, and their loyalty was bought. But if they had enough money, these were obviously the ruling class, the upper class, they could get a big enough army to take over a huge portion of the country. None of the warlords conquered anywhere near the whole country of Japan, so they fought with each other, and that means it was a period of conflict, of war, suffering of the average citizen, of course, as you see happening around whole sections of parts of the whole world, frankly, but especially in Ukraine for the last 7 months, you see this suffering of a civilian population which had no, role in these warlords' battles, but they were caught in the middle. So there was quite a bit of suffering and death, and even things like plagues and hunger, because these warlords were trampling over each other's territory and fighting back and forth to take over different parts of Japan. So it's the era of the warlord. You can just leave it at that, or you could say shoguns. I just spelled that Shogun. So this guy was a warlord or shogun. He built this multi-tiered, and you see it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 levels, same as the tallest pagodas that you'll see if you go to the one that's at the Japanese Tea Garden. I mentioned this on Monday. That's now just recently reopened. It's 5 stories, built by and for the Japanese government for the 1915 World's Fair in San Francisco. And now it's been restored and it's open to the public. But that's a common amount of height. Anything of 3 or more. Most pagodas are at least 3 stories, but just multi-story. I gave the definition. This fits, of course, but it is not a Buddhist house of worship. It's a military installation. So this architect, whoever it was, working for this warlord, decided to use the pagoda style to design this castle. And it's one of the last things to say is one of the last remaining intact older castles in all of Japan. Most of the others were destroyed either during the warlord era, by being burned or destroyed by a rival army, or were torn down and replaced with modern buildings. This is one of the few surviving intact. You see, it's over 400 years old. And therefore, it's on the UNESCO World Heritage List. I mentioned that, I believe, right, when we covered, or did I with some of the Islamic? Yeah, I think we did, didn't we? When we got to, well, I have to go back and see because, yeah, Taj Mahal, that obviously would be on UNESCO. That's capital letters. It's United Nations Cultural Organization. It's a very important, helpful group that has no political bias. It's just the group that helps maintain and restore historic and natural wonders all over the world. Every country has at least, well, every major country has at least several UNESCO heritage, they're called World Heritage Sites. And that's UNESCO is U, capital letters, UNESCO. I assume some of you have heard of it. So the UNESCO World Heritage Agency designated this castle as a World Heritage Site. That marks it as pretty important. I just said, of course, it's one of the few remaining examples in all of Japan. Right, that's the whole meaning. And then for formal elements, it's interesting to see the differences in the textures and the materials, because these are all real textures. You have real rough stone for the base, right? And then you have a real smooth stucco for the walls and real smooth tiles. Japanese tile tends to be, in many other Asian countries, not red like it is in Europe and Latin America, but they're still the same material, smooth clay, right? So smooth clay tiles, the real texture of smooth clay tiles is on the roof, but just happen to be a blue color. And then the real texture of glass in the windows. Okay, those are the 3 textures. And then the modeling, of course, is just the shadows created by the sun coming from above. But this definitely has a mixture of dynamic and stable. The walls clearly stable. The right angles on the corners, and the flat walls. But the roof lines, and these are called eaves, in case it wasn't clear, that's what that means, right? These projecting sections of the roof that are supported by wood beams, by the way. In fact, you could just see that if you look closely here. The point is that is all dynamic. So it's both almost equal parts dynamic and stable. It's completely symmetrical. If you were to stand in front of it, this wing, the side wing here on what's our left, and if you stood right there and looked up at it, this is, of course, left to right, symmetrical and unbalanced, weighted toward the bottom. But there's another wing like this on the right side. It's a very large, hundreds of people, maybe 1,000 could live here. And of course, these are the people that guarded over this warlord and his family, and it was his servants and, advisors and all that. So they would have lived in a fortified castle, literally. It's also on a hill, so that makes it harder for enemy soldiers to attack. And then once they got if they got all the way to the top of the hill, Of course, they'd be fighting their way through soldiers trying to prevent them. Then they would have trouble getting in because you see the walls up to, oh, good 10 feet on the base are all stone. So it's kind of hard to knock that down, those kind of walls. Let's see, rhythm, of course, is repeated shapes of the windows and the overhanging eaves. You can just say the roof lines. And then the largest mass would be, well, it would be the first level. If you break it down this way, I would, that the base and the first story is really all one mass. And obviously it's much wider than what is above it. Each level gets slightly narrower. So the second largest mass would be the second level and then the third. And let's see, modeling line. Oh yeah, line here is visual line. You can't really see any carved or there's no painted line. So it's a visual line formed by the shadows at the corners and around the doors and windows. And for proportion and scale, I don't think you can say this is in any way distorted or abnormal. I mean, it's a structure that's each level is the size it needed to be for the purpose. So there's no distortion or exaggerated proportions. And of course, it's a single structure, so there's no alternate scale between this. If there were two buildings side by side, maybe there would be, but it's just a single large extended structure. So there's no kinds of abnormal scale or proportion. Okay, and color, it's almost all cool. Blue tiles, white stucco walls. The only thing warm is the stone at the bottom. Okay. This is the next must know, and it's Fusuma, F-U-S-U-M-A, F-U-S-U-M-A. That's the title, just one word. That is the name of this structure. We'll say what it is in just a second. The artist's name is an architect, of course, but remember, architects are artists. I know some people don't think of architects as artists, but they definitely are. The architect's name is Itoku. That's capital E-I-T-O-K-U. And that's 1573. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the interior of a Japanese home. And it's the main social room within which several social activities were conducted. What would those be? That'd be the main meaning of a building member. And on the the second midterm and the final, this is important to remember that with a building, a slide of a building that you need to write about, that for the meaning, first thing you should write is the purpose. So this is a private residence designed by one of the top architects of that era in Japan, one of the top Japanese architects of his era. And I already told you his name was Itoku. He was designing for almost certainly an upper class family, a house with several, you can just see several rooms. This is one of those for, group gatherings. The family would be an extended family. It probably was 3, maybe 4 generations living in the same house, which is still true in many parts of the world, less so in America now, but it used to be not so uncommon here in the United States. So multiple generations of the family with their servants would probably fill this room up whenever they had an important dinner, or when they had what's still being done in parts of the world, including here in the US. You can find places such as the Japanese Tea Garden at Golden Gate Park, or some of the sake bars that there are in the Bay Area. The Japanese tea ceremony, some of you heard of that. So that's an important part of the meaning, that this room was meant to hold various group events, from large extended family dinners to guests, people invited to join who weren't part of the family, large formal dinners. Also a Japanese tea ceremony, which is almost always done in the daytime. And you don't need to know the details, but if you go to the Asian Art Museum, there's a room recreated much, much smaller than this, where that's described on the wall. Extra credit option. It's a great museum. You can't see it in just an hour or two. I would recommend at least 2 hours. It's next to City Hall, or across from City Hall, Civic Center, and parking garage right in front of it. City-run parking garage. The Asian Art Museum has a whole section on Japanese art, and there's a room like this, though much smaller, that's recreated in one of the exhibits halls at the Asian Art Museum. So Japanese tea ceremonies are hundreds of years old, and they were observed by a lot of families, even the poor ones often. But this person would have been wealthy. We know, I mean, there's several reasons we know. First, because the room is so large, but also the detailing on the painting of landscaping, they would have had to have pretty good, standing or income to hire a really talented local artist. I mean, look at the beautiful details here of this tree and this, I guess it's a heron, sorry, it's obviously very, or a crane, maybe a crane, a very large bird. And then you have mountains with fog or clouds, and more trees and rocks and bushes. It's beautiful. And each panel is part of, here's the one other term that I didn't put, I used to have it on the list of terms, but I'm trying to keep that list shorter these days. So it's not a term you'll see, a standalone term on the final. It's not on the, of course, list of terms, but it's a term that relates to this slide, and that's shoji screen. Shoji, I'll spell for you, but remember, you don't have to worry about the spelling of any words when you're writing the answers on the remaining 2 exams, except those on the syllabus. But I'll spell it for you. Shoji, S-H-O-J-I, is a type of thin rice paper or other thin material. It's a screen that divides rooms in a traditional Japanese tea house. Tea house implies, some people think, just a little building where all you do is drink tea. No, that's more, you can say traditional Japanese home if you prefer. That's what we mean. If the family, middle class people could afford this, and many other public buildings did that as well. These are rice paper screens which can be moved or opened separately or all at once to open up or close off rooms from each other. It's a very innovative or inventive, is what I was thinking, a technique which is used in a number of public buildings here in this country, including churches and various public, buildings. Even some offices do that, right? Commercial offices. Where the screens can be open one at a time, or part of them, or all of them at the same time. And light comes through because it's such thin paper. But on this one, most of the times these rice paper screens, shoji, again, S-H-O-J-I screens, were plain, just the color of the actual paper itself, or the material. But here it's obviously been painted and stained. You see that the colors here to give it a rich, warm texture. Okay, that's pretty much the whole meaning of this. What I will add one more thing, the simplicity. Yeah, this is an important fact. Of Japanese architecture has become an inspiration to countries around the world, or say cultures outside of Asia, for over 150 years, because American and British, or you can say American and European architects, studied Japanese architecture as a very, very adaptable system, such as these screens, or even more important, the simplicity. Look at the walls. This is during, the time when, if you went to Europe, you'd see the most ornate Tudor, from Elizabethan times, or even later in the 1700s with Versailles. Remember, we saw, right, the Hall of Mirrors, Baroque art. But here in Japan and many other Asian cultures, but especially Japanese, domestic architecture was very simple, very functional. And that, of course, is now the main trend, has been for over a century in Western architecture, at least for not everybody, but most home builders and architects. And it starts with people like Frank Lloyd Wright and Bernard Maybeck and Julia Morgan, people we're going to talk about and will be on the final when we get to the last couple of weeks of the class. So all I'll say, I'll summarize it again. The last fact about the meeting is that this style of architecture, the Japanese tea house or simple home, was an inspiration for has been an inspiration for over 100 years for many American and European architects, because of its clean lines and simple, uncluttered look, which is what's preferred in most modern design, not just for houses, but for public buildings as well, churches and so forth. Okay, Formal analysis, well, it's warm except for the white, and that's plaster now. So that would be painted plaster. That's, of course, cool, but everything else is exposed wood beams. Now, that's the real texture of rough wood and the real smooth texture of rice paper and polished smooth wood on the floors, if that's not obvious. These are obviously not original. These mats were added. So what you see here is the smooth, real texture on the floor and the real rough texture, both of wood on the ceiling and the framing. But then smooth real texture on both the rice panels, or what you could just say wall panels, and on the upper walls where the stucco is. It's completely stable. There's nothing dynamic about the structure, but there are dynamic details on the painting, of course, on the walls. Okay, and then the rhythm should be obvious. The framing of the building is visible. That's not decorative. That's the structure of each room and the walls. So that creates rhythm, as do the latticing, right? Features here, the wooden framing and latticing in between each beam. And of course, there's rhythm, obviously, on the paintings on the wall. There is modeling on the wall screens because of the landscape painting, but otherwise there's no modeling anywhere here. And then we have its space. It's one large open room with about a 12-foot high ceiling. Okay, one large open room with about a 12-foot high ceiling. And I don't know the dimensions because I've never found a photo that shows how far behind the photographer the floor goes. So just say it's a rectangular, I should say, rectangular, large open rectangular shaped room with about 12-foot high ceilings. They might be 13 feet, but that's close enough, about 12 feet. High ceilings, in other words, they like that in Japanese architecture. Okay, and then let's see, I think I've said everything's stable, right? Oh, there's no altered proportion that I can see here or scale. It's all, natural, normal. And of course, it's a single room in a single house. So there's no comparing it to something. And balanced, yes, very balanced, symmetrical if you draw the line down the middle. And if you draw the line halfway from the floor to the ceiling, again, balanced top to bottom, left to right. Okay, let's see. Whoa, this loves to jump here. We're getting too far ahead. Before we leave this, I'll just mention one other thing. You don't have to write this. Yeah, the fact that the warm exposed wood, again, is something that if you come on the walking tour, that will be 20 points in one afternoon. You don't have to do anything or write anything. I'll be doing that on a Sunday in November in Berkeley once I've contacted the owners of some of the homes I'm talking about, which were designed by architects 100+ years ago in Berkeley. You'll see some of the effects of what we're talking about just for your own knowledge. You don't have to be tested on that. That's just for your enjoyment, and the extra credit. It's worth 20 points. I'll be doing that on a Sunday between 2 and 4:30 in November once I have a neighborhood where I can get us into some of those homes that aren't open to the public. So some of you help, I'll see a few of you there, worth the 20 points and also the experience. You'll see what I mean by influence of Japanese detailing, and at least a couple of the buildings we should be able to get into on that walking tour. But that's well over a month from now. Okay, this next must know, okay, is lacquer box. Pretty straightforward, the title, lacquer box. Lacquer windows. Lacquer is Lacquer box. And the artist's name, we know his last name is Korin, Korin. You can ignore a little c. Remember, I've said this the whole semester. We put it there just for accuracy because that means we don't know the exact date. So it's around 1700. So was that over 300 years old, of course? Circa 1700. Okay, so lacquer, of course, is right a kind of wash or treatment that is brushed on over usually wood. Well, this is a wood box. Okay, may look metal, but it's wood. It has metal hinges, or you can say bracing. I'm sorry, I meant braces, not hinges. Braces at the corners to reinforce it and also for aesthetic effect. So there's some metal here, but it's almost all the box itself. The walls on the lid are wood. And it's by one of the most famous lacquer box painters. Lacquer boxes are very popular in cultures ranging from Eastern Europe. If you've traveled in those parts of the world, certainly in Russia, they're very popular. And in Turkey, in the Middle East, Palestinian territories, and in Israel, and even in Egypt, and then all over Asia. So just, you could just say in the Eastern Hemisphere, right? especially though around, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, far Eastern Asia. Lacquer boxes have been around for hundreds of years. They're a very popular medium because they're affordable for, even some of the working class families to put valuables in, of course. But this one's a little higher and probably more expensive than the average working class family could afford. So it was for a wealthy client. This is mother of pearl inlaid, beautifully done. And obviously those are white flower blossoms here. And then we have, I call them bulrushes, the kind of plants that grow on marshlands that we see all over the edges of the bay, of course, in the Bay Area, and of course, everywhere in the world where there's marshland, and there's a lot of marshland on the coasts of Japan. So these plants would be the kind of waterborne plants that you could see in a marshland, and that is a traditional Japanese landscape detail. And then we have the alternating light and dark areas. We'll do the formal analysis in a couple minutes. Broad areas of dark as a background that visually contrasts with the brighter areas of the white flower blossoms and the almost golden yellow water plants or floating plants. And so those are all classic Japanese landscape type of techniques. So this is not ukiyo or anything like that. It's obviously not a print, so it's not part of that tradition of the Japanese print style that we talked about with the first slide. It's just a good example of hand craftsmanship by a very talented artist and craftsman. Remember, crafts qualifies. A couple of you've done your first paper on some crafts, jewelry, right, or watches. That's perfectly fine if you chose to do that. And for extra credit, you could also forward me articles. In other words, art in this class doesn't only mean a museum quality art that you see in a museum or a gallery. It can be handmade objects that are really finely detailed or finely made. That's what this is, of course, a high level of hand craftsmanship. Okay, is it stable? Let's do the formal elements. Stable or dynamic? Well, the box is completely, right. Well, there's a slight curve here, of course, on the very corners, but it's mostly stable. But the detail, so the box itself is stable primarily, but the painting is all dynamic. There's no straight lines here that I can see on the waterborne or marsh plants or on the white flower blossoms or on these bands of metal, the bracing at the corners and a little bit across the top. So those are at diagonals. So there's no straight lines here. So the illustration on the surface of the box is all dynamic. The box itself is all stable. For space, it's a single open box. It's about a little less than a foot long, and about 8 inches tall. I'm just rounding off. So just say one large open rectangular box, less than a foot long and several inches tall. That's good enough. There's overlapping for space on the painting, though. Don't forget the flowers overlap the marsh plants, and the plants, right? The waterborne plants overlap. That's supposed to be symbolic of course, the surface of a lagoon or marsh. So the plants overlap the background. There's plenty of rhythm, of course, the repeated shapes, obviously, of the blossoms, of the white flower blossoms, and of the waterborne plants. And then even these braces, they form part of the visual effect. So there's a lot of rhythm. There is no modeling that I can see. The mother of pearl has a natural variation of colors within the material, but that's not technique. That's not something the artist created. So there's no modeling as a technique. And then it's balanced, I would say. It is balanced roughly, depending on which, but you draw a line down the middle and then this way, top to bottom. Some people would say this side of the box, the one, facing us now, the long side, somewhat more weighted toward the bottom. So you could say that's unbalanced toward the bottom. But the top of the box, the lid, which is what most people will be looking at, is definitely very carefully balanced. Line here, well, I don't really see painted line. There's visual line around the edges of the waterborne plants because of the black background that's supposed to represent the water. But there is line here around the edges, but it's inlaid. It's not drawn or painted or carved. It's inlaid. When the artist inlaid, had to do each one separately, slowly by hand, each section of mother of pearl. to create the flower patterns. So there's inlaid line, no carved drawn line. And again, there's no unrealistic proportions or scale here between the different parts of this composition, not that I can see. And of course, it's warm on the plants, the waterborne plants, neutral on the background, and cool on the white blossoms in the middle. Okay, again, it likes to jump here. Now, I'd like to be able to show you this, but I didn't see a lot of information on it, and we're going to end a little early today, but I'll stick around, as I always do, for any questions you have afterwards. But I love this piece, but I didn't put it on syllabus, so you guys don't have to write notes. But you can see how it has it should be obvious, a definite and deliberate, whimsical quality to it. A giant bull charging, looks very clearly, or about to charge, maybe just getting aroused or angry and gonna get up and charge someone that's irritating it, or another animal or a human being. And then you see the companion, is this tiny little white monkey or monkey-like creature, which I don't know if there's even any clear identity to what kind of species that is. It's just that, the juxtaposition here that would be, if this was on the syllabus, I'd be telling you, of course, that there's obvious distortion in the scale of the two animals to each other. I don't think proportionally even the largest bull would perhaps, maybe, but I don't know if any other, maybe newborn monkeys are that small. I don't know. It's distorted. It's deliberately distorted for a humorous effect. Okay, but it's not on the syllabus, so let's move on to the last two slides. And the very last slide I'm going to tell you right now, the Great Wave, that we're going to spend a few minutes on, because it's not only so famous, but it has a very high probability, not just possibility, of being on the final, and that will be right after this. Okay, so we have two more must-knows. So here's the second one from the last one. The title is 3 words: Otani Oniji acting. Otani is O-T-A-N-I, and then Oniji is O-N-I-J-I. Otani Oniji acting, the name of course, a famous Japanese actor. The artist's name who did this print, we know who it is Sharaku. That's S-H-A-R-A-K-U. S-H-A-R-A-K-U, 1794. This is a classic example of ukiyo, because as I said earlier, and if you didn't write it then, you should now, because it's really the main part of the meaning, is this is one of those pleasures that we should enjoy while we're alive, while we're on earth, while we have the chance to enjoy them. A good theater, Japanese theater, of course, is hundreds and hundreds of years old. It's performed still to this day all over the world, right? There's several different types of Japanese theater, but we'll not go into that kind of specific fact. But what we should say, this guy, this actor, and you see his name is in the title, Otani Oniji, was one of the most famous, some say the most famous Japanese actors of his era. Very popular. His performances were always sold out. In other words, you had to really, be fast to get a seat in a theater where he was performing live. So he was so famous that his portrait was created, as you can see here, by many different artists, but this is one of the most famous portraits of him in the middle of a play. So the artist was probably sitting in this, he might have been invited to come up behind the stage, perhaps, but he could easily have been in the audience. And when he was present in the theater during a live performance by this actor of a Japanese play, right? That's how this was created. The artist was in the theater, and he would have sketched him in the middle of a very intense moment in that play. And it looks like the face is somehow distorted. Maybe most people looking at that think, now that couldn't be the way the guy actually looked while he was acting, but yes, it is. It's because this particular form of Japanese theater was all about exaggerated facial expressions, body language, and dialogue. It was melodramatic. And that is still the case with many kinds of Japanese theater that are still seen today. So again, it was a form of Japanese theater that exaggerated human emotions through their facial expressions, body language, and dialogue. So he's in the middle of some kind of intense emotional moment in the middle of a play where he's the star. And again, I already said it's about Ukiyo, I'm sorry, and that is why this is considered one of those pleasures that people should, if they can afford to or manage to get a seat for, if not from famous actors like this, at least theater where they could get a place in a live theater. It was a very popular kind of social entertainment throughout Japan, and yes, even working class families could occasionally, maybe a couple times a year, afford to go to live theater in their own town or their own region. But this was in Tokyo. This would have been, at the point where Tokyo was over 1 million people and was the capital of the kingdom of Japan by this time. The warlord era was coming to an end by the time this was done. So there wasn't quite as much chaos and warfare and suffering, and there was a more prosperity in Japan. And so more people could afford to go to theater or out to eat or, any music or other performing arts. All right, so formal analysis. Is it balanced? Well, again, it depends on where you draw the line. If you draw it below his chin and you include part of his, back, his shoulders, I would say it's roughly balanced. But there is empty space in the upper section above his head. So some people would think that it's unbalanced toward the bottom. Left to right, though, I definitely would call it balanced because he's placed where part of his body, a good roughly half of his, I meant to say half of his body, is to the right of the midline, just the way the arrangement of his body, his hands and his head. So it's roughly balanced left to right, perhaps slightly unbalanced toward the bottom. Simulated texture is minimal, but it's very detailed on the hair. And you could even say the eyebrows, but not so much on the clothing here. It's implied, but it isn't realistic or sharp detail on the simulated texture, except for his hair, and some would say even his eyes, but not the rest of his face. The lines, bold outlines, as Japanese prints tended to do, and he's at a sharp diagonal. You see his whole body is pitched in the same diagonal line as that first print we saw with the Japanese brothel, the first slide we saw today. So it qualifies as a classic example also of Japanese print making. The lines are mostly bold. If you look closely, that's a relatively bold line. You could dispute that and say, well, some of the details on his face are thin outline. But overall, you look at the outer edge, around his eyes, his eyebrows, his mouth, and the edges of his costume. That's a costume, of course, he's wearing. Those are mostly bold. So it's mostly bold outline, maybe with some thin outlines around details of his face. The rhythm is obvious. Even his hands with the fingers extended out there look like he's about to strangle someone or try to grab something. So his fingers obviously are powerful rhythm, and that's part of his performance. And this work of art is emphasizing that. His obvious face, his eyebrows, his eyes, and the patterns on his clothing. It's a lot of rhythm. I don't see a straight line in it. And so it's really dynamic. I don't think there's anything stable. And then the largest mass, it's just him. There really aren't any other smaller masses here. For space, the only technique I see is overlapping. I don't see foreshortening really because of the way he's hunched over, and I don't think you see enough of his shoulders. So it's really just overlapping of his clothes over him and his body over the background. The colors are cool gray in the background, neutral black on the hair and parts of his clothing, and warm on the main part of his robe. And then here his skin tone is a light yellowish pink. So that would probably be natural skin tone. In any case, it's not pancake white like those first two women in the first slide. So it's not cool. It would be considered warm skin tones. Okay, and then the proportions here, well, here you could get it. To me, it does seem like his head is slightly exaggerated for the proportion to it could be that's how he really was. There are people slightly larger than average heads in proportion to their body. I've had several friends that tell me that themselves about their own physique. So you could say maybe it's a realistic portrayal, but it appears, at least in this image, to be exaggerated, the head and the neck, because that's where the emotion is focused, where his acting is concentrated. So that appears to be a distorted or exaggerated proportion, but there's no scale. Remember, it takes two separate objects side by side or more to create alternating scale. So there's no distortion of scale. Okay, I think we've got in the rhythm, I think is obvious, right? Okay, so let's move on to the most important work today. And I'll go ahead and tell you that. This one won't be cut from the study list. One of the most important and famous works of art probably ever created, at least in the last 200 years. It's known all over the world. And it's one of, I think many of you have seen it, one of my favorite works. Okay, so make sure you take good notes and study them for the final. This is the last slide, must-know slide for today, is The Great Wave, just like it sounds, 3 words. The Great Wave. The artist's name is Hokusai. Hokusai, that's Hokusai, Hokusai, Hokusai. And the date is 1831. If you don't already know this, many of you wouldn't have reason to, but you could start with who was he, Hokusai. Hokusai was by far the most popular and successful, therefore the most famous. The two together would make you famous. The most popular and successful Japanese artist of his era. And today, he's the best known Japanese artist all over the world. That's absolutely true. I've seen prints of this and others of his paintings on the walls of people's homes all over the world. So he's the most famous Japanese artist in the world today, even though he died nearly 200 years ago. Why? Because he took the traditional Japanese print technique of an oblique angle and the bold outline, right? We already covered that by now. You want to remember that's true of if any of these slides of the drawings or paintings are on the test, that's a basic part of all of them, that they have the Japanese print technique that I just described. So he took those techniques, have been around for hundreds of years, and he applied them to native Japanese landscapes in a unique setting or unique moments of nature. This would be, of course, a tsunami, right? A wave that would have been, who knows, after an earthquake or even just, stormy weather. So we have a giant wave about to completely, well, probably sink these boats. And it appears to be 3 boats, or is it 2? It's hard to tell because here's one boat, but they seem to be long enough. So let's say it's 2 long boats, wooden boats that are about to be sunk by this wave. And the men are clinging to the boats for dear life, right? This is not Yu-Gi-Oh! Don't confuse it. It's nothing about Pleasures of the Flesh here. This is all about traditional Japanese landscape being used as a setting to make a statement about the power of nature as it was experienced in Japan and still is. You know about the earthquake of 2011, killed, wasn't it 30,000 or 20 or 30,000 people? Could easily have been more, and destroyed a nuclear power plant. You've all heard of that one, right? It was 10 years ago. I mean, they have major earthquakes throughout the Japanese islands. So this is Mount Fuji. That's an important part of the meaning. Fuji, some of you know that is the tallest mountain, and it's a volcano. A snow constantly year-round, there's snow-peaked mountain called Mount Fuji. It's almost the symbol of the country of Japan. It was by the time this man was painting these things. So he created a book with dozens, that's all I have to say, I can't remember how many, but several dozen images of Japanese scenery and landscape where some kind of force of nature is emphasized. In this case, a tsunami, or you can just say a tidal wave, and that's what that word means, which is engulfing or about to sink these 2 boats that are helpless, quite literally. There's nothing they can do about it. But he gave the ways why people like this so much, almost human characteristics, as though these were the hands of a living creature. You can see that, right? If it doesn't jump out at you right away, he meant that. He meant to say there's a spirit or some kind of, energy underlying nature that can be seen in the power of events or acts of nature, like flooding, tsunamis, hurricanes, earthquakes, what have you. All natural, of course, disasters, really, that have always been a danger in Japan. And he was showing the power and in his mind, the beauty of nature. Not if you're on that boat and you're one of these people down here clinging for dear life, you might not be thinking about how beautiful the power of nature is or how impressive. You might not even want to know about it, but he's taking a look at a distance and getting us to see the beauty of the powers of nature in a Japanese landscape setting. He usually had Mount Fuji in most of his prints in that book. That book became popular all over the world, even before Van Gogh started doing Japanese style painting. Some of you know Van Gogh, you could add as the last fact. He was very admiring, right? And influenced by Japanese prints and paintings. He studied them. He never went to Japan, even though he did travel quite a bit, but only in Europe. But he bought some or went and saw them in museums and galleries. So he was influenced during part of his career. Van Gogh was directly influenced by Japanese print making and painting, and he was very, very influenced by this artist, Hokusai. He wrote letters, we know. We'll have to guess. Oh, it looks like he said that to his brother. Van Gogh said, oh, I admire the Japanese traditional prints and have tried to emulate some of their techniques. Not in all his painting, but many of them. Okay, that's plenty on the meaning. So let's wrap up with a formal analysis. And I think we're going to end just a few minutes before 15. But this, I'm going to do all the elements on it because there are some exaggerations here, of course. But let's start with, is it stable or dynamic, whether or not a straight line? It's completely dynamic, the entire, except for the title here and his signature. I think that was his signature here. And then this is the title in, of course, Japanese language, the Great Wave. Okay, so this is really deliberate in most of his works, every line. In fact, most Japanese prints, you notice that with the three now that we've seen, would have been dynamic totally with no straight lines anywhere. And then, of course, the largest mass would be the main wave or great wave that is rising up and about to crash onto the boats below. And then if you break it down, you'd say that the closest boat is the second largest mass. Or you could say this wave here, because it is cresting or has just crested. And then the third largest would be the closest boat. For perspective or space, I'm sorry, it looks like scientific perspective. He knew that technique. So it could be there is a vanishing point. You could say it appears to have a vanishing point somewhere behind the mountain, Mount Fuji. But it definitely has overlapping, foreshortening, and diminishing size on the boats and on the waves. And so those three techniques are the ones we're sure it has: overlapping, foreshortening, mostly on the boats, but a little bit on the water too. And diminishing size. I wouldn't call this atmospheric perspective. If you get up close, see it's not hazy over the mountain, which it could be at different times of the day, but not here. Okay, the lines are bold. That's just a given with the Japanese painting and prints, and this is a print. Bold outlines around the boats, and of course all around the edges of all the waves and the mountain. Okay, and then we have the rhythm is obvious with the waves. You can almost say fingers or crests, if you prefer, that's more accurate, of the tops of the waves, both the one that's already crashed or crested and the one that's about to. And of course, then there's the rhythm of the boats themselves and the alternating darker and lighter sections of the water that you see in the lower portion of the surface of the water. Well, this would be the ocean. This is the ocean of the Pacific Ocean is where this would have been taking place. That leads to the modeling. Yes, here there is no question there's modeling, much more so than most Japanese prints on the waves themselves, on the big wave about to crash and the one that just did. And I see a little bit of modeling on the two boats, mostly in the front wooden decorative panels. Not on the mountain or on the surface of the water, but there is modeling. But you could say the dark blue and light blue and then fading into white where the cursor is a kind of a modeling here. Textures, is it realistic? The boat, yes. I would say Mount Fuji too, because that is, I've seen plenty of documentaries, films, movies, photos of Mount Fuji at a distance, and this is just what it would look like. So you could say there's implied, if you want to simulate texture on the mountain, and definitely I would call that simulated texture on the wooden boats. Is this simulated texture? Is it realistic? It's implied on the water, but it's not realistic. Obviously, waves don't have hands or fingers, but there is some effort to get across the feeling of the power of the wave. with those curled tentacle-like endings, but that does create some kind of similar texture. But the water itself has the smooth texture of an ocean wave or the surface. Is it balanced? No, it's not meant to be. It's unbalanced toward the left, clearly and deliberately. Top to bottom, also unbalanced toward the bottom, no matter where you draw the line here. Okay. And then I said proportion and scale. Well, those are two very important things with this and all of this artist, Hokusai's work. He did this. He would exaggerate certain elements or sections. Clearly, there is an altered scale of the great wave, or all the waves really, to the boats. I mean, this is, larger than almost any wave, and the way it's curving and cresting up like that at that angle is exaggerated. So I would say yes, there's a deliberate distortion or altering of the scale between the boats and the waves. And the proportions of the water that form the two waves, particularly the tallest, the great wave, is also larger than it would most likely be. I don't know. I've seen, quick aside, I've seen a tidal wave. It was in Santa Monica after the earthquake in Alaska in 1965, was it? We lived right on the beach. It just moved from Chicago. And that's pretty scary, but it was a 10-foot tall wave. Waves can get this tall. That's like 30 feet practically, but it's rare. So it's almost certainly, it's an imaginary scene. It's exaggerated. The proportion of the water that is forming the wave is exaggerated, enlarged, what would be normal. Okay, I think we've covered, all the elements of composition. Oh, color, sorry. Cool blue and white. And the only warm colors are really bits of brown on the two boats on the wooden portions. Some would say in the background, the sky just behind Mount Fuji, that is a kind of a warm tan color. This appears also the rest of the sky to be cool. Okay, well, right, we're at the end of this. This lecture's right on time. Okay, I'm going to stick around like I always do and answer any questions that any of you might have. So again, I think everyone now knows that. Yeah, are there any questions first before I give one? Yeah, we're going to now continue doing each week ahead of the lecture. We're trying to say, don't just log in on YouTube. Muting going on here. That is that the lectures are based on what's in the book. It's true that you can just study. I think you found this out from the midterm, from the notes. I said that before the test and how to study for it. And the same will be true for the second midterm and the final 2 more tests. The notes from class are what you need, but also you should still do the reading each week because it gives you context or background, and it makes it easier to understand the meaning and less likely that you'll have to write as much about the meaning of each slide. Okay. Any questions now about anything we've just covered? Extra credit. Oh yeah, your midterm grades. I think I did. I said this Monday, but I'll repeat it now, and you'll have an email to remind you. I will have all of those grades back and entered to my logbook by the end of this week. So I'm not going to say Friday night is a family night for me. So I'll say over the weekend, no later than Sunday afternoon, probably by Saturday, if not even Friday evening, but you can start checking. I'm going to post the lectures by 8 p.m. So that should give you an option, of course, to see. Oh, he said it's our midterm grades at the same time. I may do. If I don't, you'll have them. And we've got a muting issue here. Okay.
Excuse me, Mark.
Yeah, sure.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, it's Tanya.
But I hear too much background noise. Go ahead. If you didn't already unmute yourself, do it again. Yeah, there was too much noise from someone else's. Go ahead. Now's the time for any questions. Yes. Hi. I hope you're still. So Tanya, if you're still there, I'm going to hang on.
Hello.
Yes, Tanya, welcome again.
Hi. I'm in the reading center, and I'm going to have them. So obviously, I'm not understanding what else I needed to do for the.
Oh, I already sent you. I can't do it 3 times.
No. They're going to help me fix it.
Yeah.
They're going to help me fix it.
Oh, Excellent. But you have the email still? Now, if you didn't have that, I could resend that to you. The one I sent you
Yes,
yesterday,
resend it. Yes, yes, resend it.
I'll do that.
Okay,
Absolutely.
yeah, because I'm like, wait a minute, I
That's
need
fine.
help.
Take that, print it out, and then go over it with, that's a perfectly
Okay,
good way to, that way they
yeah,
should be able to cover everything. I
because I'm like,
know.
there's something I'm not understanding.
Well, I think when you combine my explanation, which was not just one
Mhm.
sentence, it was like a paragraph of what
Okay,
it is you need to add with the requirements for, you know, the studying that I mentioned.
yes.
You could even go back and watch my lecture on how the test
Oh,
is
okay.
given, but you might not need to do that if you've got people with you helping you
Mhm.
look through
I
my
do.
email and your own paper and comparing that, or not paper, but answers.
Mhm.
We won't get into too much detail. Anyway, you get the idea. And it's okay if I don't get it until tomorrow morning or something. It's okay,
Okay,
even by noon, but hopefully before noon.
I got it.
Perfect. I'm glad you asked that. All right. Any other questions for anybody about extra credit or the material we've covered
What,
now or any
what,
other?
what are some of the other things we can do for extra credit?
Well,
Just do another paper?
No, that's too much work. Yeah, for 10 points or so. No, besides a walking tour, which is worth 20, but that's optional. And of course, you have to drive to Berkeley for that. And that'll be in
Mhm.
November on a Sunday. But also you can watch a movie or documentary, 1 hour minimum or longer, about any artist or type of art or cultural style, of art. World art, remember, is the subject. It doesn't have to
Mhm.
become the period of covering, and write 2 pages about what you learned. I've already
Okay.
mentioned that, but no one's done that yet. And of course, your architecture option, you can go on your own and take 4 photos of any building or architectural site that interests you and put them into a PDF, and that's worth 10 points. And everyone knows about the museums. Or I hope all of you will, or who have an interest in anything relating to ancient Egypt. I don't know anybody that's not at least somewhat interested in
Ooh,
ancient
I
Egypt.
am.
Yeah, almost everybody I know is. I can't stress too much that exhibit that's there is a unique opportunity. Don't miss it. Even if you don't need the extra credit, you get
Oh,
10
I'm
points
going for
to show.
sure.
Yeah, and then there are other museum exhibits they'll be open. There's one on Diego Rivera.
Diego Rivera.
I'm looking forward to that. That's at the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, and that's
Mhm.
in downtown San Francisco. But it has a parking garage right below it. It's very easy to take the elevator up to the check-in, and and there's student discounts. Don't forget that all the museums in the Bay Area have a lower rate for students. So bring your ID whenever you want to go to an art museum. And those
I
you're going to
think that's wonderful.
yeah, 10 points for each of, say, 2 museums. And then there are my art themed novels, which I only mention that because that's an easy 15 points if you just download or order either one. And that's also already in the list of options for extra credit that I sent everybody. And if you need me to resend them, I can. They're in the course grading policy handout I went over in class on the first day of class, first week. Okay, so hopefully some of you are thinking about extra credit, or if you're one of those people who hadn't yet done your paper, it might be good to try and get them in sooner rather than later, like the next week or so. And it's only 10 points off, of course, but hopefully you don't wait till late in October when you're backing up against the other assignments, which will be the second midterm and the final, as well as an extra credit deadline. So maybe a couple extra credit options will flow in over the next few days or so, and a few other late papers. Okay, I've got another class to prepare for, but I'll stick around again a couple more minutes if there's still.
This is Tanya.
Yeah.
My grandfather is half Japanese and he knew how to make sushi. And I ate sushi as a small toddler.
Yeah, well, then
So I consider myself very lucky.
I didn't start eating sushi till I was like in the late grade school, because that's when my parents knew that couple, the Japanese pilot and the wife, who was from one of the art schools in Chicago. She met my mom, who was also an artist. Yeah, but I wasn't a toddler then. I think I was like 11 or 12 when I started eating sushi. Well, anyway, that's of course a personal note, but a relevant one. One more time as we get ready to sign off. Anybody else have any really urgent questions relating to extra credit or anything we've covered this week? Don't forget, these lectures will be posted on YouTube by 8 p.m. Friday, probably.
There is an apartment complex here in Santa Rosa that's very unusual looking off of Wailupa.
Well, if it has some architectural interest and you think you could get 4 different photos, not just all of the same detail.
No, I want to go there and get some photos.
Then the 4 photos and turning into a PDF, and then you do just need to say the site, what it is and where, and your
Okay.
name, and send it to me as a.
Because it's very unusual.
Okay, well, sounds interesting. That's worth 10 points. 4 photos,
Okay.
right, with the
Okay.
title, where it is, and your name.
Okay.
All right, so everyone have a good weekend or 5 days between now and when I see you on Monday. And of course, on Monday, we're covering a topic that is very relevant for this class and for everyone living in California, the Hispanic cultures of ancient and, more recent sites in Mexico, Central America, South America, and the Northwest and Southwest of the United States. So that's the topic for next week, Art of the Americas. So I hope you all be here for that, and I'll see you all on Monday. All right, have a good week, a good weekend. All right, take care. Bye.